Imagine waking up in a one-room hut. The floor is dirt, the roof leaks, and your family sleeps side by side with the animals. Every day is a fight against hunger, taxes, and backbreaking labor. Yet somehow, you find moments of joy, faith, and celebration. This was the life of medieval peasants, the people who carried all of society on their shoulders, but were rarely remembered in history. In today's video, we'll uncover what life and survival were really like for peasants, their work, their families, their faith, and how they endured in a world stacked against them. Stay with me until the end, because their story will change the way you see the Middle Ages. And before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join Quiet Boring Sleep, where we bring the hidden stories of history back to life every week. Chapter 1. Daily life of the medieval peasant. When you picture the medieval world, it is often kings, queens, castles, and knights that first come to mind. Yet those figures represented only a very small fraction of the population. The overwhelming majority of men and women living in medieval Europe were peasants, ordinary people whose lives revolved around the soil, the seasons, and the constant effort to provide enough food to survive. Their lives, though often overlooked, form the very backbone of medieval history. To understand the medieval wealth gap, you first need to enter their world, the fields, the cottages, and the routines that made up their days. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a small timber-framed hut thatched with straw. The floor beneath your feet is made of hard-packed earth, perhaps covered with rushes or reeds to soften the tread. If you are lucky, smoke from the small hearth curls upward through a hole in the roof, though more often it lingers in the air, leaving your eyes watering and your clothes scented with firewood. The single room is crowded. Your children and perhaps your elderly parents sleep nearby, often sharing a bed for warmth. Livestock, chickens, a pig, or even a calf may share the same space, separated only by a wooden partition, since animals were valuable and keeping them indoors provided both security and warmth. A peasant's home was small and humble, but it was functional. It was not built for comfort in the modern sense, but for survival. Furniture was minimal, a rough-hewn table, benches, perhaps a chest for storage. The most essential possession was the hearth, where meals were cooked and bread baked. Bread, after all, was the staple of life. In many regions of medieval Europe, peasants consumed bread at nearly every meal, sometimes supplemented with vegetables, porridge, or pottage, a kind of thick soup made from whatever grains and garden produce were available. Meat was rare for peasants, except on feast days or special occasions, and even then, it was often a small portion compared to the bulk provided by grains and legumes. The rhythm of daily life was set by the land itself. A medieval peasant's calendar was dictated not by the clock, but by the sun and the seasons. From early spring to the late autumn harvest, work filled nearly every waking hour. Men, women, and even children worked the fields, plowing, sowing seeds, weeding, and harvesting. Tasks were divided by necessity rather than strict gender lines. While men often did the heaviest plowing and reaping, women managed gardens, cared for animals, spun wool, baked bread, brewed ale, and raised children. Children, too, worked from an early age, chasing birds away from crops or helping to gather firewood. Despite the hard labor, peasants did not own much of what they produced. Most lived under the manorial system, in which they worked land that technically belonged to a lord. In return, they paid rent, sometimes in the form of money, but more often in grain, labor, or other produce. This obligation meant that even in good years, a large share of the harvest left the peasants' hands. In bad years, when crops failed due to weather, pests, or disease, hunger loomed close, and peasants bore the brunt of it. Religion permeated daily life. A peasant's world was filled with the rhythm of church bells, calling them to prayer, to mass, to confession, or to holy days. The local parish church was often the largest and most important building in a village. Even the poorest peasants contributed to the upkeep of the church through tithes, typically 1/10 of their produce. The church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a powerful landowner, often rivaling secular lords in wealth and influence. For peasants, religion offered both comfort and discipline. It provided explanations for the hardships of life, but it also reinforced the social order, teaching that one's place, whether poor peasant or wealthy noble, was ordained by God. But peasant life was not unrelenting drudgery. There were moments of festivity and community. Feast days, weddings, and seasonal celebrations punctuated the year. During harvest festivals, peasants might gather to sing, dance, and drink ale together, briefly setting aside their burdens. Even ordinary tasks were often done communally. Villagers worked together in the fields, repaired houses, or shared in the slaughtering of animals, strengthening bonds of cooperation that were essential for survival. It is important to understand that not all peasants lived equally. Some were free tenants who rented land from a lord and had a degree of independence. Others were serfs bound to the land, unable to leave without permission, and obligated to provide not just produce, but also labor for the lord's fields. Within peasant society, too, there were small gradations of wealth. A rich peasant might own a plow and several oxen, while a poor one had only a spade and perhaps a goat. These differences mattered, shaping opportunities for survival and marriage prospects. The daily realities of peasants reveal the stark contrast to the lives of the nobility, who lived in castles, feasted on meat, and commanded armies. Yet without the constant toil of peasants, the entire structure of medieval society would have collapsed. Their labor fed not only themselves, but also their lords, their kings, and the clergy. They formed the foundation upon which the glittering world of knights and royalty stood. And so, when you think of the medieval wealth gap, you must begin here, in the cottages and fields of Europe's peasants. Their world was one of simplicity, but also of relentless demands, shaped by forces far beyond their control: the soil, the seasons, and the power of those above them. But what happened when this fragile balance was disturbed, when harvests failed, taxes rose, or war swept through the land? How did peasants endure the crises that so often threatened their survival? Chapter 2: Work, Food, and Seasonal Struggles. If you want to understand the life of medieval peasants, you must look beyond the image of a farmer bent over his fields. Their existence was not simply about sowing and reaping. It was about endurance, surviving the unrelenting cycles of work and the constant uncertainty of food supply. It was about dealing with the changing seasons, with the ever-present threat of famine, and with the ceaseless demands placed on them by both nature and their lords. The burden of work, for peasants, labor was not just an activity. It was the defining feature of life. The medieval year was divided into agricultural tasks, and each season carried its own expectations. In spring, fields were prepared with plowing and planting. In summer, crops were tended and hay harvested. Autumn brought the exhausting work of gathering grain and storing food. Winter was quieter, but it was not idle. Repairs had to be made, tools sharpened, and livestock cared for. The sheer physical intensity of this work cannot be understated. Plowing was backbreaking, requiring oxen or horses to pull the heavy wooden plows through soil that was often rocky and uneven. Reaping grain involved bending for hours under the sun, swinging a sickle or scythe. Even the more domestic tasks, like grinding grain by hand on a quern stone, required constant effort. Peasant families often rose with the sun and worked until it set. Days might stretch to 12 or 14 hours in summer, though shorter in winter. Unlike modern workers, peasants had little concept of time off, except for holy days. And yet, paradoxically, some scholars point out that medieval peasants may have had more actual days of rest than many modern workers, because of the church calendar. Feast days and saints' days, sometimes numbering over 100 per year, gave brief reprieve from work. Of course, this did not mean life was easy. The sheer uncertainty of food supply made survival precarious. The centrality of food. Food was at the heart of survival, and the medieval peasant diet was both monotonous and uncertain. Bread dominated, particularly in Western Europe. In wheat-growing regions, white bread was prized, but peasants often consumed darker breads made from rye, barley, or oats. Pottage, a thick soup of grains, beans, peas, and whatever vegetables could be grown, was the second most common staple. Meat was a luxury. While lords and nobles feasted on venison, pork, and beef, peasants relied heavily on plant-based foods. They might occasionally eat pork if they raised pigs, or small amounts of salted fish. Eggs, cheese, and milk supplemented their diet, though famine years forced even these to be sold rather than eaten. Ale was the everyday drink, brewed weak to quench thirst safely. Since water was often unsafe to drink, the peasant diet was not nutritionally rich. Chronic malnutrition was common, particularly in years of bad harvests. Even in good years, peasants walked a fine line between sufficiency and hunger. Bad weather, disease, or war could tip entire communities into famine. The seasonal struggles. To truly appreciate peasant life, you must walk through the seasons with them. Spring. This was a time of both hope and hardship. The hungry gap, the weeks before new crops could be harvested, often left granaries bare. Food was scarce, and peasants relied on whatever dried grains or salted foods they had left. At the same time, spring demanded enormous effort plowing, planting, repairing fences, and preparing fields. Summer, the labor did not ease. Haymaking was critical, since hay was needed to feed livestock through the winter. Children were tasked with scaring birds away from ripening crops. By late summer, the grain harvest began, a time of unrelenting work where entire villages turned out to reap the fields. Autumn, harvests of grain, vegetables, and fruit were gathered. Peasants threshed and stored grain, preserved food, and prepared for the long winter ahead. It was also the season when rents and tithes were collected. For many, this meant giving away a significant share of what they had just harvested. Winter, on the surface, this was a quieter time. Yet it was also the most dangerous. Food supplies dwindled, animals had to be fed, and sickness spread more easily in the cold months. For those without enough firewood, cold and hunger combined into misery. Winter also meant repairs, spinning wool, making clothing, and other tasks essential to survival. The seasonal cycle shaped everything. It was relentless, offering little chance to step outside the rhythm of work and need. The threat of famine, perhaps the greatest shadow over peasant life, was the constant threat of famine. In medieval Europe, famine was not an unusual catastrophe, it was a recurring reality. Crop failures due to cold weather, excessive rain, or drought could quickly lead to widespread hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 provides one of the starkest examples. Years of unusually heavy rainfall destroyed crops and led to widespread livestock deaths. Grain stores rotted, and peasants were forced to eat whatever they could find: roots, acorns, even animals not normally consumed. Chroniclers describe people eating cats' dogs, and even reports of cannibalism in extreme cases. While not every year brought famine, the memory of hunger haunted every peasant family. This fragility underscored the gap between rich and poor. While nobles might draw on reserves or import food, peasants had no safety net. One failed harvest could mean starvation, the demands of lords and the church. As if nature's demands were not enough, peasants also faced unrelenting claims from above. Under the manorial system, peasants were obligated to provide their lord with part of their harvest, as well as labor services. They might be required to spend several days a week working their lord's fields, building roads, or repairing fortifications. In addition, the church required a tithe, typically 1/10 of a peasant's produce. This obligation was non-negotiable. Even when food was scarce, the tithe had to be paid. To many peasants, this felt like a crushing burden, though the church framed it as a duty to God. The combined weight of these demands meant that peasants lived with very little margin for error. A poor harvest might leave them with nothing once their obligations were met. The Lord and Church were fed first. Peasants survived on what remained, resilience and coping strategies. Despite these hardships, peasants developed ways to endure. Communities pooled resources, sharing tools, oxen, or labor. When famine struck, neighbors often relied on one another, though this support could only stretch so far. Seasonal migration sometimes occurred, with peasants seeking work in other regions. Women played a crucial role in survival. Their work in gardens, dairies, and households ensured a steady supply of small but vital resources: vegetables, eggs, butter, cheese, and wool. Brewing ale was another essential task, as it provided both sustenance and a small income. Festivals and holy days also served as coping mechanisms. They offered not just rest but a sense of hope and community. Even when food was scarce, people celebrated saints' days or Christmas, sharing what little they had. The fragile balance. What emerges from this picture is a life lived on the edge. Every season, every harvest, every obligation carried with it the possibility of ruin. The wealth gap was not merely a matter of luxury versus poverty. It was a matter of life and death. Nobles and clergy lived with security, drawing on the labor of peasants. Peasants themselves lived precariously, constantly balancing work, food, and survival. The story of medieval peasants is one of endurance against the odds. They carried the weight of an entire society on their backs, often with little recognition. Without their labor, the grand feasts of nobles and the power of kings would have been impossible. Yet their own meals were meager, their homes simple, and their lives fragile. But what did this relentless struggle mean for family and community life? How did peasants find meaning, raise children, and preserve traditions in the midst of constant toil? Chapter 3. Family, Faith, and Community. When you imagine the life of a medieval peasant, it is easy to picture endless fields and weary laborers bent beneath the weight of their toil. Yet survival was not only about food or work. It was also about people, families bound together in fragile households, communities woven through necessity, and faith that provided meaning in even the hardest moments. To truly understand the peasant experience, you must step inside their homes, listen to their prayers, and walk among their neighbors in village life. The structure of the peasant household. The medieval peasant household was small by modern standards, often consisting of a nuclear family, parents and their children, though extended kin sometimes shared the same space. A typical peasant home was a simple one-room building of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof and an earthen floor. Wealthier peasants, sometimes called yeomen or free tenants, might have slightly larger houses with more than one room, but even then, comfort was limited. Furnishings were minimal. A wooden table, benches, perhaps a simple bed frame stuffed with straw, and a chest to hold possessions. Most slept communally, parents and children huddled together for warmth. In winter, animals might be brought inside the house, sharing the same space, adding warmth but also smell and noise. The hearth was the heart of the home, providing heat, light, and the means to cook pottage or bake bread on stone slabs. Despite the sparseness, the household was the foundation of survival. Each member had roles to play. Men tended the heavier fieldwork, women cared for the home and garden, and children were introduced to labor almost as soon as they could walk. The role of women in peasant life. Women's work was indispensable. They managed gardens, grew vegetables, cared for chickens, and milked goats or cows. They processed wool, spun yarn, and wove fabric into clothing. They brewed ale, one of the most important tasks, since ale was safer to drink than water. In addition, women played a central role in child-rearing, healing, and maintaining traditions of oral storytelling. They were midwives, caretakers, and teachers of household skills. In some cases, women also took over field duties if their husbands were absent or if they were widowed. Widowhood was common, and widows often had to fight to retain their rights to land, sometimes remarrying quickly for survival. Life for women was neither easy nor free, but it was essential. Their labor was the invisible backbone of the peasant household. Children and survival. Children were expected to contribute from an early age. By the age of 7, they might already be scaring birds from fields, carrying water, or helping in the household garden. Childhood as we think of it today did not exist in the same way. Life expectancy was low, and infant mortality was high. A family might have several children, but only a few would survive into adulthood. Those who did survive were trained to continue the cycle of peasant life. Sons learned farming skills from their fathers, while daughters absorbed domestic and agricultural knowledge from their mothers. Education beyond the village was rare. Only occasionally did boys attend schools run by the church. For most, learning was practical, immediate, and grounded in survival. Community bonds in the village. If the household was the core of survival, the village was the wider net that held peasants together. Life in isolation was impossible. Only through collective effort could peasants endure the demands of agriculture and the obligations of lord and church. Villages typically consisted of a cluster of homes surrounded by open fields. The open field system meant that land was divided into strips, and peasants cultivated their allotted strips while also sharing responsibilities for common pastures, woods, and meadows. Cooperation was essential. Tasks such as plowing, harvesting, and maintaining hedges often required communal labor. Socially, villages were close-knit. Everyone knew one another's families, histories, and reputations. Gossip and reputation carried weight. A family standing in the village could determine whether neighbors lent tools, shared labor, or offered aid during lean years. Disputes were inevitable, but they were often resolved through village courts or informal mediation. Festivals, weddings, and feasts punctuated the rhythm of village life. Even in hardship, these gatherings were moments of joy and solidarity. Music, dancing, and communal meals provided much-needed relief from the relentless grind of survival. Faith as comfort and obligation. Religion was not merely a belief system for peasants. It was the framework through which they understood their world. The local parish church was the spiritual and social center of the village. Peasants attended Mass, observed feast days, and marked the rhythms of life, baptism, marriage, and burial through the church. Faith offered meaning in the face of hardship. Hunger, disease, and death were explained as part of God's will. The promise of heaven provided comfort, while the fear of hell reinforced obedience. The saints, too, were central figures. Peasants prayed to local saints for protection of crops, livestock, and family health. Pilgrimages, though costly, were undertaken as acts of devotion or penance, but faith also brought obligation. The tithe, 1/10 of produce, was demanded by the church, regardless of whether a family could spare it. Priests reinforced social hierarchies, reminding peasants of their duty to both God and their earthly lord. In many ways, religion was both solace and burden, guiding peasants through life while also tightening the structures that kept them in poverty. Moments of celebration and rest. Despite the constant hardships, peasants were not without joy. The medieval year was dotted with festivals tied to both the church calendar and agricultural cycles. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days provided opportunities to gather, feast, and celebrate. May Day, with its dances and songs, celebrated fertility and the renewal of life. Harvest festivals gave thanks for the year's crops, however meager. These celebrations were more than entertainment. They reinforced community bonds, passed traditions down through generations, and offered psychological relief from hardship. In moments of song, laughter, and shared meals, peasants reclaimed a sense of humanity in a world often defined by struggle, the weight of obligation and control. It is important not to romanticize these communities. While there was cooperation, there was also tension. Lords demanded labor services and rents. The church demanded tithes. Taxes were ever present. Village life could be oppressive as well as supportive, with little room for individual freedom, yet peasants adapted. Some fled oppressive lords to seek refuge in towns, where new opportunities awaited. Others carved out modest independence through hard work, slowly accumulating enough resources to improve their standing. The medieval world was not static, even for peasants. Mobility, though rare, was possible, endurance across generations. When you step back and look at the life of medieval peasants, what emerges is not only struggle but endurance. Families carried traditions forward despite loss. Communities held together despite hardship. Faith provided meaning even when life seemed unfair. This endurance built the very foundation of medieval society. Without peasants, there would have been no food for nobles, no tithes for churches, no surplus to fuel towns and trade. They were the invisible majority, the silent backbone of Europe, whose lives rarely entered the pages of chronicles, but whose labor sustained kingdoms. A reflection on legacy today. When we look back at medieval Europe, we often focus on kings, battles, and cathedrals. But the true story of survival lies in the peasants who endured endless toil, hunger, and obligation. Their world was harsh, yet they carved out meaning in families, faith, and community bonds. Perhaps the greatest lesson from their lives is resilience. They remind us that even in the most constrained conditions, human beings find ways to endure, to celebrate, and to hope. And yet, one question remains. If peasants were the foundation of medieval society, why do we so rarely remember their names, their stories, or their voices? And that was the everyday reality of medieval peasants, not the knights, not the kings, but the men and women who kept the entire medieval world alive through their work and their resilience. Their lives were often hard and unfair, yet they shaped the very foundations of Europe, as we know it. Thank you so much for spending your time with me here on Quiet, Boring Sleep. If you enjoyed this journey into the quieter, often forgotten side of history, please give this video a like. It really helps more people discover these stories. And if you know a friend who loves history, share this video with them too, so they can experience it right alongside you. I'll see you in the next story, right here on Quiet Boring Sleep.